Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio. And now, here's our host, Dr. Vanessa Anceloni.
Welcome, dear listener, to Kardec Radio. Today, the show is about the neuroscientific evaluation of the brains of mediums. It's actually the latest scientific research on the topic. We're going to get to know more about the ins and outs of this research with the very leader in this field of research, Dr. Andrew Newberg from Penn State University. He's here with us, and very soon he's going to be unfolding the behind the scenes of the research and most of all the results. What do they mean? And there's so much you can ask. You can call us and ask a question to him if you want. We are live, 858-769-4705. By the way, this is a toll-free number, 1-800-858-769-4705. Or you can do as usual, send us an email. We have been receiving emails, kardec@kardecradio.com, or at the chat room of blogtalkradio.com. By the way, we are in the front page of blogtalkradio.com. Last show, when we talked about the Happy movie with the director, Rocco Bellic, we got more. It's already in the records, 50,000 listeners. It's amazing. We know Kardec Radio has been nourishing many souls around the world in more than 60-plus countries. And we are happy about it because all we do, share good news, share good stories, and also the preparation for a new humanity, one that is not only ethical, but is also caring. And here we're going to talk about today also several segments. We'll be breaking down inspirational insights regarding Kardec's take on mediumship, also more on ethical education. We have a specific segment with Bernadette Leal on how to discipline the mind, how to teach children about the discipline of the mind. And at the end of the show, we'll wrap up with Dr. Fonseca and Gabi Ferreira when they are going to bring together the family meeting that they entitled God at Home. By the way, we have our sister radio, Web Radio Bazaar Online, which is at the website www.spiritist.com, and it's located in Florida. They are retransmitting Kardec Radio shows live and also on demand several times during the day and during the week. So all you have to do is log on and get Kardec Radio there and much more. They have programs also in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. For all those covering all bases, if I may say this way. Well, Kardec himself, in 1857, as a great researcher, he was also puzzled about the effects of mediumship on the body of the mediums. And in question 483 of the Spirits book, Allan Kardec asked a question about the possible physical insensitivity or alterations in the physical disposition of some mediums. And it's quite fascinating that the explanation that the mediums received at the time included the fact that a possible magnetic effect could act on the nervous system and change even the perception of these mediums. Well, there's so much in all of Kardec's books that could tell us the direction of what mediumship can do to the body, but not as specific as the most recent research has been bringing to us with very high-tech apparatuses to investigate the activity of the brains of mediums. And here we have Dr. Newberg, collaborator, leading this research, together with Dr. Júlio Pérez and Alexander Moreira, in Brazil. They published the most recent advancement in that regard, a paper that talks about How Mediums Shed Light on the Brain Activity During Trance State. It was published on November 16th on a peer-reviewed journal, and you can read more about it. I would recommend mostly the Thomas Jefferson University newsletter, which is the www.newwise.com, where you can search for Brazilian mediums, and they will have a summary for you. If you want the paper, you just click on their article. They have the paper on the very journal where it was published. But you can also get more information about this and much more that Dr. Newberg has been researching on his very website, www.andrewnewberg.com. And there you're going to get to know not only who he is in regards to his professional positions as the Director of Research at the Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. He has been also publishing many books such as the latest, Words Can Change Your Brain, and the one that became so much quoted in the United States, How God Changes Your Brain. Fascinating. And you have also a tab in his website that summarizes his research. For example, when he did research on the effect of meditation on brain activity in Tibetan meditators, which is quite interesting, and we will get to know more how much of that can also overlap some of the findings in regards to the mediumistic activity and its implications in the brain, as well as one in which he talks about speaking in tongues and how that affects the brain as well. If you have a question, again, you can call us at 858-769-4705. For those who already sent us questions by email, don't worry, we will address this throughout the show, but you can also go to the chat room of blogtalkradio.com and send us a message, a question, so we can address it during the show. For now, before we bring in Dr. Newberg, we'd like to kickstart the show with a beautiful message that was actually written by the very renowned Brazilian medium Chico Xavier. We wish he were here in the flesh so we could understand more about his mediumship. Probably the legacy is already there for us. He received this message in form of psychography. It's entitled Omnipotent Love, and we're going to stream it to you. You can buy the CD and the book at the bookstore of the Spiritist Society of Baltimore at www.ssbaltimore.org. Let us listen to this. Soon after the break, we have Dr. Newberg here with us at Kardec Radio.
Omnipotent Love. At the distressful time of crisis in which circumstances took your soul into trial, many believed that you would no longer rise. However, when shadows thickened around you, you found the blinding light, which impelled you toward the path of hope bathed in sunlight. In the cell of disease, many admitted that nothing was left for you but to accept the scythe of death. However, at the extreme moments, intangible hands caressed the exhausted body, renewing its warmth, so that you would not leave incomplete the service that marks your presence on earth. In the midst of temptation, many agreed that decadence was all that was left for you. However, at the edge of the muddy cliff where you were, an invisible arm manifested itself, deterring you. In the valley in which you threw yourself without thinking, many despised you for good. Nevertheless, at the threshold of madness, you received inner support that guarded your heart, reconstructing your life. In the hut of loneliness, in which the most cherished relatives relegated you, many believed you to be forlorn. But at the end of your weeping, which appeared to be endless for you, you experienced an unexplainable uplift that encouraged you to seek new bonds which honored you. while in the midst of turmoil that envelops you during the day, think about God, the omnipotent love, which does not forsake us. No matter how great the affliction, He will bring a balm that consoles. No matter how obscure the problem, He will give a fair and correct solution. Even so, do not hasten in personifying or defining Him. The word of Christ is enough for us. He who revealed God is our Father. Above all, do not bother if someone denies God's existence, even if their words shine in the world, because you will find God within your heart in moments of pain. It is natural that it be like that. It is when the night comes that the eyes of humanity can devise the splendor of the stars.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Kardec Radio, live, every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
The International Spiritist Council is organizing and promoting the 7th World Spiritist Congress, which will be held in Havana, Cuba on March 23rd through the 25th of 2013. The Congress theme will be Charity and Spiritual Education in Building a World of Peace. 150 years of the Gospel according to Spiritism. For more information, please visit www.7cem.org.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
A new great book and tool for kids and educators. The children's book, Our Father by the Spirit Meimei, psychographed by Chico Xavier, is available for purchase at www.edisayofamerica.com. Buy your copy today.
And now we return to our program.
We are here, dear listener, talking about evaluation of mediums' brains. And to discuss about it and lead us into new understanding in that regard, we have the very leader in the field of this research, Dr. Andrew Newberg. If you want to know more about him, his website is andrewnewberg.com, and you can get to know about his latest book, Words Can Change Your Brain, or the one that became so renowned, How God Changes Your Brain, and so many more. And here he is with us. He's the Director of Research at the Marna Bryant Center for Integrative Medicine at the Thomas Jefferson University Hospital and Medical College. Thank you so much, Dr. Newberg, for being with us today at Kardec Radio.
Oh, thank you for having me on your program.
It's so fascinating, your collaboration with the Brazilian scientists in regard to this very, very paper, the one that was just published about how mediums have changed their brain during that trance state. And what can you tell to the listener regarding to, were there any specific, could you summarize to the listener the main findings on this paper?
Well, the main thing that we were looking at were changes that were going on in the brain when the mediums who we were studying were involved in the task of psychography, which it sounds like a lot of your listeners are familiar with. What we actually decided to do, one of the things that was interesting is trying to figure out how do we design a study to look at something like this. And we actually did a kind of brain imaging technique called SPECT imaging, where we actually inject a small amount of a radioactive tracer into a person when they're in a particular state, in this case the psychography state. And but then after they complete the psychography task, then we actually put them into the scanner, but the scanner, even though they're not doing the psychography then, it tells us what they were doing at the moment that we did that injection, at the moment that they were deeply into the psychography. So what we were able to then see is what's going on in the brain when they are doing the psychography, and we were particularly interested in areas of the brain that are related to language, So there are areas of the brain that are specifically involved in generating and thinking about language. We wanted to see what happened in those areas, whether they wound up being increased or decreased during the task. And we were also interested in other parts of the brain, such as the frontal lobes, which help us to concentrate and focus our attention on different things. We were wondering what would happen when somebody was engaged in the psychography task to the frontal lobes, this area of the brain that helps us to be in control. And I would say that the most interesting overall finding was that the people who were able to get into the deepest levels of psychography actually demonstrated decreases of activity in a lot of these areas. It's almost as if those areas of the brain that are normally involved in language and concentration shut down, so that this kind of alternative process, whatever we ultimately think is truly going on, is something that we can talk about. But the psychography process itself seems to kind of take over the brain, so to speak, so that the kind of the normal areas of our brain that help us in our everyday life, those are the areas that are not part of the process of psychography, which of course makes a lot of sense because it's a fundamentally different kind of state of mind.
And when you talk about psychography, I know you explained this in the paper as one of the forms of mediumship, like the writing mediumship. But there is a difference between psychography and one that is mostly renowned, that is automatic writing. So did you go in depth trying to rule out the mediums that were more like unconscious than the ones that were more conscious about what they're doing?
Well, this is always kind of a very interesting. There's a lot of interesting issues that arise when we start to do these kinds of studies, because trying to get at what is exactly going on inside of a person subjectively is always something that in some sense eludes us as investigators, because the moment that we ask them, well, how were you unconscious? Were you in a trance state? Were you how were you doing this? If we were to interrupt them while they were doing it, of course, then we would lose that state. So to some degree, we have to rely on what the individuals tell us and how, in terms of how they experience it, what they understand is happening to them. For those individuals that we studied, they did describe it to us as psychography. They described it as entering into a trance state and then writing down pretty much whatever flowed through them through the spirits that they were in contact with. But in terms of whether or not it is specifically the psychography state as understood by mediums or a form of automatic writing, that becomes a much harder thing to distinguish, at least on the basis of this initial study. This was our kind of first attempt, and I think that your kind of question is a perfect question for the next steps, which is, can we really start to look at where the differences and similarities are between other aspects of writing, such as automatic writing versus psychography, perhaps versus of various types of creative writing, and to really try to get a sense as to where the similarities and the differences are, to better understand what's happening within those individuals who are engaged in those processes.
And it's fascinating, the study, because you categorized by mainly like the most experienced mediums versus the less experienced mediums. And it's quite fascinating what you found out in regards to lower levels of activities in some areas in more experienced psychographers that would tell that they were more deeply entranced or in the dissociative state of mind than ever imagined, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, you raised really a very important aspect of this particular study, which is that we actually had 10 people who came up from Brazil to participate in the study. And when we looked at their scans all together, we really struggled to find a specific difference between the psychography state and our comparison state, which in this particular study was just normal writing. We just had them write whatever they felt like writing. And of course, that in part we had to do that because if we just had them at rest doing nothing, and then we had them during psychography, well, they're doing a lot of things during psychography that you're not doing while you're at rest. So we really wanted to isolate the kind of the spiritual element of that, the thing that really differentiated psychography from other aspects of writing, and in this case, again, it's a limited sample, but we started with just regular writing. And when we looked at that, when we looked at all 10 people altogether, we really did not come up with any clear difference between the psychography state and the regular writing state. That made us start to think about, well, what's going on? Why are we missing that? What's actually happening? And as we started to talk with the individuals who had come up, we learned that there was a fairly good division within this group of individuals as to who were considered to be the expert practitioners and those people who were less expert, novices, so to speak. Although even the novices had a fair amount of experience, but not to the same level. And when we they actually divided pretty much evenly. There was 5 and 5. And when we looked at that was really where we saw some very fascinating differences. So as you mentioned, the very experienced psychographers, they showed decreases of activity in the language areas, in the frontal lobe areas, suggesting a very different state of the brain. Mm-hmm. Now, the less experienced people actually had increases of activity in those same areas. And that to me is a very interesting finding, because it suggests that there's some kind of training effect, if you will. There's some kind of process by which when you first start out, your brain is attempting to do a particular thing with the psychography, but then you go to another level with it, as you mentioned. And I think that there's a lot of similarities, for example, to learning an instrument, like a musical instrument. When you first start to play a piano, for example, you have to concentrate on every note that you hit because you have to translate the notes into things that your fingers do. But as time goes on, it becomes so much easier for you. You do it almost without thinking about it. And it kind of flows through you, certainly when you get to be an expert. So everybody's playing the piano, but they're doing it in different ways with their brain, and it somewhat is suggestive of what's happening here with the psychography.
Exactly. And when you're saying about the training effect, it reminded about a quote in the very paper you wrote about Chico Xavier, because in Chico Xavier's experience, though he was an unparalleled medium in regard to psychography, but you can tell that there is an evolution in his own mediumistic life, let's say this way, because at the end of his life, past 65 years of exercise on psychographing, at the very end, he was able to do those type of mediumistic practice surrounded by people, and with so much, it's about the letters that he received from the beyond, amongst many people, and he would receive this message, and the reliability of the information that was received, it's told that he was deeply in trance, and nothing around him would bother him. So, I don't know. It just made me think that probably it's what you said, like the more you do it, the more you evoke that pathway, if we may say, because in your study, I don't know, can we tell there is a pathway for psychography already in the brain?
We probably can't quite go that far, but we can certainly talk about a pattern of activity. When you talk about pathways, you ultimately are thinking about how different parts of the brain are connected, and I think that this particular research is at least pointing us in the direction of what that pathway would be, and I think obviously having more studies with more individuals who do it in slightly different ways and so forth would be really powerful in terms of advancing our knowledge of what's truly going on in the brain. But clearly when we start to think about the areas of the brain that we see being involved, parts of the frontal lobe, parts of what is called the anterior cingulate, which is a very important part that regulates our emotions and regulates our attention, parts of the temporal lobe, which is also part of our language area, as well as parts of our emotional centers of the brain, such as the hippocampus, which help us with memory and recalling things, as well as guiding our emotional responses. All of these were the areas that were involved in this process, and So you can start to construct what you think the pathway will be based on the notion of how do we. Normally, when we write, if we were to write something that's emotional, we would activate our frontal lobes, we would activate the language area of our brain in the temporal lobe, and perhaps the hippocampus to help us with our emotions and our memory. So that's how we would normally write. Fascinating that those areas go up in the less experienced people, but go down in the more experienced. So it seems that either those areas of the brain shut down, become more efficient. We don't know exactly how to interpret the decrease, but the other thing, and you had mentioned this in the introduction, is how does this study compare to one of our other studies, which also looked at a trance state, which is the speaking in tongues study. And again, in that state, we see decreases of activity in some of these same areas, which suggests that when you engage, when you kind of disconnect the normal, the quote-unquote normal, maybe normal is not the right word, everyday processes of the brain, you allow for these other areas of the brain or these other phenomena to kind of take over and allow the brain to do the things that, to experience that spiritual self, the spiritual world, in a very different kind of way. And so I think and that's very distinct, for example, from those people who do practices like prayer or meditation, where you are deeply concentrating on a phrase from the Bible, a particular prayer, a particular a mantra or a visual object, something that you are concentrating on. And therefore, we see a very distinct pattern from those people who are engaged in these kind of trance-like activities and where the person actually experiences themselves as being taken over, if you will, by the spiritual world, by a spirit, by the Spirit of God, however it's defined by the individual.
It's quite interesting as you're saying this, because we received a question from Paul Oregon, because in Kardec's book, The Medium's Book, he asked this question about whether mediumship, the relationship between mediumship and mental health.
Right.
And we know that in your study, you have you had the mental health questionnaires to these mediums, and they pointed that they were very healthy mentally speaking.
Right.
Right?
Yes, and I mean that was certainly part of our exclusion criteria for our study, to make sure that we had people who, other than the psychography process and that belief system that they partake in, have no evidence of other types of psychological disorders. And what has generally been shown, and obviously not in all circumstances, but what has generally been shown is that people who engage very deeply in spiritual practices, have religious beliefs, these are individuals who often derive a great deal of support and strength from those practices. It does help to enhance their overall psychological well-being as well as their spiritual well-being. And now, of course, one of the very interesting questions in this kind of larger field of studying religious and spiritual behaviors and phenomena in the brain is what happens when things don't go so well? What happens when people become terrorists because of their religious beliefs, or kill people because they don't agree with them? And that, to me, is a very fascinating other piece to this. But sticking with what we know about our psychographers, what we looked at in terms of our speaking in tongues study, which is that as far as we can tell, these people have very normal psychological states. Most of them are married. They have children. They have jobs. They're otherwise normal individuals who engage in a very interesting and powerful practice for them, and which has a lot of implications for their own sense of self and well-being. And I think that this helps us to understand that link a little bit better. It obviously, we weren't looking at how the psychography lowered their anxiety, or we didn't look at that specifically through this study. But to me, that would be part of, again, some of the next steps that we would want to see is when people engage in these kinds of tasks, when people, we were very impressed by those people who were doing the speaking in tongues study, and how it had a tremendous impact on their emotions and how they felt afterwards. It was very powerful for them, as for the psychographers. So I think that this is, again, another sort of step in understanding that. It tells us a little bit about, if you're talking about the hippocampus, if you're talking about the anterior cingulate, these are parts of the brain that help us to regulate our emotions and to modulate those emotional responses and to help us with our emotional health. So the fact that they're involved in these practices does point to the possibility that these practices can potentially be beneficial. And, of course, if there are certain circumstances where somebody truly becomes psychotic as a part of these kinds of practices, it would probably be helpful to understand that as well. And, again, that's rare, but it's important to understand. It's important to understand when these practices are beneficial and when they are detrimental to people.
Exactly, and especially in regards to psychography, for example, which is so well controlled. Kardec said in the Medium's book that one of the types of mediumship that you could easily practice without much, bothersome in regards to the ability to control the context and the content is psychography, and it's interesting because it's a task that expectedly you would think that the prefrontal cortex would be highly involved, especially the left one. And I think this is one of the most surprising elements in your research, right? The decreased activity of it.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think this is consistent with some of our other ideas that you had mentioned, our book, How God Changes Your Brain, and some of the other research that we have done, where we basically see that the frontal lobe is part of the process in helping people to engage a particular task, but that especially when people enter into these very powerful kind of spiritual states, flow states, mystical states, depending on the circumstance, that these areas of the brain actually seem to start to shut down, and it really allows for a very different kind of brain process and ultimately a very different kind of experience for the individual.
Exactly. So, Dr. Newberg, we're going to give a very short break. When we come back, we have a few more questions also by some listeners.
Sounds good.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Kardec Radio, live, every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
A new great book and tool for kids and educators. The children's book, Our Father by the Spirit Mei, psychographed by Chico Xavier, is available for purchase at www.edisayofamerica.com. Buy your copy today.
Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
The newest edition of the Medium's book by Allan Kardec is now available. Purchase your copy online or via your ebook reader. Simply go to www.edicofamerica.com today.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Spiritism for Everyone, the online study of the Spirit's Book and the Gospel according to Spiritism. Spiritism for Everyone meets every Wednesday evening and Saturday morning using the latest technology in web conferencing. You can join in from any computer in the comfort of your home or office, no matter where you are in the U.S. or the world. Spiritism for Everyone is open, free, and requires no registration. To access the web live meetings, go to www.spiritus.us. Spiritism for Everyone is a program of the United States Spiritist Council.
And now we return to our program.
Well, dear listener, we are here talking about the neuroscientific evaluation of the brains of mediums, and we have here with us Dr. Andrew Newberg. You can get to know more about his amazing career. He has been the leader on the religious experiences and the effects on the brain, much more than that, but you can get to know more at his very website, andrewnewberg.com, where you get a hold of his research findings, the latest ones, and also regarding to his several books, especially the latest one, Words Can Change Your Brain. Dr. Newberg, in this very book, before we go back to our study here, the very book, Words Can Change Your Brain,
yes.
You said that this can also have some overlap with the very research that was recently published, right?
Yes.
How so?
Well, I think that the part of the basis for doing the study on psychography is that we're talking about an aspect of language, an aspect of how we express ourselves, about how we receive or relate information. And this comes down to how we express ourselves with words, and part of what led us to our book, Words Can Change Your Brain. And we were thinking about it not so much in these unusual states such as psychography, but in the broader context of how do we discuss and describe things, how do we think about things, because whether we're talking to a loved one, a worker, a colleague of ours, a friend, a family member, we have to express ourselves, and how do we do that, and how do we try to do that in a way that's effective and compassionate, allows us to get our feelings across, and allows us to truly be able to connect with somebody else. And this is what I think language is ultimately about for us, and whether we're connecting with another person or connecting with God or connecting with the Spirit, we so often use language as part of that process, and that's really what led us down the path of looking at how words change your brain, and how do we understand that in the context of trying to make us better at communicating, more compassionate communicators, more empathic communicators, to lead to a better work environment, a better home environment, better relationships, and so forth. And that was really the basis for that. And this study was a very interesting piece to that, at least in terms of understanding kind of the outlying areas of what language can do for us, and how we can communicate with aspects of our world that we don't typically communicate with. So that's really where this all came from.
Exactly. And we have here a question from Daniel Santos, and he is saying the following. Since our brain represents the output or filter for the spirit by using different areas to express emotion, knowledge, desires, it is expected that the same area of the medium's brain will be used to express the state of the spirit communication. The problem could be on the medium side, on his or her interference with the new mental wave from the spirit communicant. How then make the distinction? Maybe we don't have the proper machinery to answer this question yet?
Well, I think that, as we were talking about at the beginning of the program, this is our very first attempt at trying to understand that. And obviously, what's exciting to me to hear are the questions that are coming in about with a much deeper knowledge of the practice and the various elements of that. These are things that we could try to tease out as best as we can. There are certain inherent limitations in what we can understand from the perspective of the human brain, and we obviously. Just in terms of technology, we can get a pretty good sense of what's happening in the brain. But even when we talk about the frontal lobes turning on or turning off, when I look at my scan, I see a little area, maybe a centimeter or so, that looks like it's more active. Well, within that centimeter are millions of nerve cells. So I don't know if it's all of them that are active or one of them or 100 of them. And if they're active, I don't know if they're turning other areas of the brain on, other areas of the brain off, what neurotransmitters, what chemicals in the brain are being affected. So the brain itself is so complex that we're really just scratching the surface, as that last question basically was suggesting, that we're just scratching the surface at truly trying to understand everything that we can understand about ourselves and about our brains and about how they work. But specifically with these very complex types of practices like psychography, which it's much easier for us to just have somebody wiggle their finger and say, okay, we know where in the brain wiggling the finger is. Here we have an extraordinarily complex process that involves trance states and getting your brain into and your mind into a whole different way of experiencing the world, interpreting that in some kind of linguistic approach. There's many different things going on. So that is part of the process. But part of it too, I think, and this is also part of what's important to me, is how do I as a scientist try my best to experience what the other people are doing. Now, obviously, I've never tried psychography itself, but through the practices such as meditation, prayer, and so forth, I think it's very important for investigators to get as good a sense as possible of the subjective nature of these experiences so that they can understand when somebody says, I felt this or I felt that, and how those different feelings are translated into what's going on in the brain.
And what about, for example, the behind the scenes of this experiment? What were, because as much as you can control, psychography is quite more easily to be controlled in regard to the setting itself compared to other types of mediumship, for example, healing mediumship, physical types of mediumship. But in regards to the behind the scenes, the making of this very research, what were the things that happened that probably you had to adjust according to the difficulties in controlling the very phenomenon? Well,
that is always a very big issue for us that we have to think about when we do our studies of prayer, meditation, speaking in tongues. We really spend a fair amount of time just in thinking about the design of the study, and this certainly was no exception. We needed to understand what the person was doing, how they were going to do it, how long it took, and of course, there's a lot of uniqueness, a lot of individuality to each of them. So we're always working within the framework of we want things somewhat standardized, because that's unfortunately sometimes how science has to work. We want everybody to kind of do the same thing, even though we know that everybody's doing it a little bit differently, and to take that into account and make sure that we do our best to create an experience for them and an environment for them where they really can engage the practice the way they typically have done in perhaps their more natural setting. So that's something that we do always kind of work towards, always try to figure out the best we can. And of course, we do also ask the individuals who are taking part in the practice how they did. Did they really feel that they were able to engage the practice the way they typically have done in the past? Was it similar, comparable to what they have done before? And in general, the answer was yes. I think everybody felt that they were able to achieve the psychography state effectively. They felt that they were able to get into the states that they typically get into, and didn't have, there was nobody who said, boy, it really didn't work for me. And of course, if somebody said that, we would have had to think very hard about excluding that data from the results. But fortunately, everybody felt pretty good about it.
Exactly. And there are two reasons why I'm asking you this question. One, because of the sample size. In the paper, you talk about this being one of the pitfalls in regards to it's only about 10 mediums. But compared to what this is about, the fact that the environment plays such a huge role in regards to mediumship in general, though scientifically not investigated at how so, but one thing is for the medium to do a medium can be a medium anywhere depending on the practice level that he or she is, but it would probably impact on the time they spent to get into that very comfortable trance state that they're used to. They are in a different environment. So we were just wondering.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because in a strange sort of way, one of the things that I've always noted about a lot of our studies, and including this one, is that I think because people are aware of what's going on around them and that this is not the natural environment, they actually seem to get into their states almost quicker and oftentimes more intensely. We actually have had very few people who said they could not do the practice, and oftentimes it has been just the opposite, that they almost felt like it was a more intense practice for them. It was a more intense experience for them. I think in part because of the other, as you said, the other environmental stressors that were part of the process that kind of heightened their brain's sensitivity and activity levels to the point that they actually really were able to get into that experience very intensely. So we were fortunate that we've never had the issue that people could not do the practice. And part of why we do the kind of scan that we do is to help facilitate that as well. A lot of a lot of your listeners may be familiar with functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, which is widely used in a lot of cognitive neuroscience studies these days. Well, the problem with that type of imaging is that you have to be in the scanner while the scan is being obtained. You have to be doing whatever task you're doing in the scanner. So you're lying down, your arms are by your side. It would be almost impossible to do psychography because you'd be like writing way down at your waist or something like that, and you couldn't see it or anything. But with the SPECT imaging, because the person can be seated, they can be writing, they can be doing whatever they want to do, and it captures that state in as effective way as possible. That's part of why we've done that in the past, as well as in this study, to be able to really enable the person to experience their practice in as kind of natural way as possible.
And in regards to the sample, we have a question here by Daniel Santos. He's asking about how many male and females you had in the sample, because usually in specifically spiritist centers where worldwide the psychography is one of the most common types of mediumship that is practiced, majority of mediums are females. What about in your sample? You had a fair split. Did you see any possible differences between male and female medium psychographers?
That's a very good question. We did have, as you mentioned, we had a fairly even split. We had 6 females and 4 males. With the sample size, I think it was difficult to really be able to, we didn't find anything specific, but I would, as we hopefully can continue this kind of study, if we could really get maybe 10 or 15 females and 10 or 15 males, it'd be fascinating to see where the similarities and differences are. I mean, clearly there are similarities and differences between men and women in general, and one would certainly expect that to be the case in the context of spiritual practices like psychography. So I think it would be very interesting for us to be able to see where those kinds of similarities and differences are based on age, based on gender, based on cultural background and so forth. Some really fascinating possibilities are there. With this small sample size, we really couldn't do that, but we're very excited to consider doing that as we go forward. If we can get another 15 or 20 individuals, about half and half, and then we really might be able to say something about that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because at least in the history of Spiritism, at Kardec's time, the mediums through whom all the information came through were female mediums. And then later on in the 20th century, we had like this boom with especially Chico Xavier's mediumship and his 400 plus books that were psychographed. And then it asked this question, I mean, the level of communications are so similar, would there be any difference? And if where would they be? And if there is, would it impact in the message itself?
Right.
These are questions for the future, right?
Absolutely. No, they're great questions, and part of why I enjoy doing these studies is I get to learn about the practices. I had never heard of psychography, or at least didn't know much about it, other than just kind of knowing what it was. But to actually have people come up and to watch it and to see how people do it and what is produced and to talk to them about it, it gives me a whole different experience and appreciation for what the practice is. And of course, this has been true I'd never seen speaking in tongues before we've done this study. Again, I had heard of it, but never had seen it. So for me, it's part of the learning process. And as I learn more about it, I know that will make my ability to study it in the future that much better, because I'll really understand it even more so and can adjust and look at all these other aspects that so many of your listeners and you have brought up throughout this. And as I've, again, learned through my discussions with the individuals who came up, our participants, and learning more about it. So it's very exciting for me to see and to learn more about these things.
And as you're talking about these different types of mediumship, what came to mind is because, for example, today, one type of mediumship that is so much in vogue is healing mediumship. And Brazil has a great number of them throughout the Brazilian country in general. People in America hear so much about John of God, but we have many John of Gods in Brazil, everywhere and elsewhere. And we were just wondering, for that type of mediumship, which is different from the speaking mediumship, as you talked about, the speaking in tongues, or the writing one as psychography, then you have this different type of mediumship, which has the potency of physical effects such as healing.
Sure.
And I wonder, what does it do to the brain at that state level? Have you thought about the possibility of researching the brains of healing mediums?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've thought about it, I guess, in the larger context of just healing practices, but certainly mediums, that takes the study to a very different kind of level, because now you have to not just understand what's going on in the brain, but truly seeing how that may have an impact on the body, and whether you're looking at things like cancer or heart disease or whatever, you want to try to better understand and appreciate how those changes in the brain are related to that. And as somebody who's now working at Thomas Jefferson University and their Center of Integrative Medicine, we clearly understand that there's a deep link between the brain and the body, and that means the brain and health. But how we can manipulate that and control that and affect that is, to me, a very fascinating question, and something that I would, again, for future studies, but something that I would love to try to better understand as we go forward.
It's quite interesting, especially because of healing mediumship. Many people talk about what they see externally, but we've never investigated what's happening in the medium at the very time that these types of mediumship are happening. So it's fascinating. Dr. Newberg, right. We have to give one last break before we ask ultimate questions to you.
Okay.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Would you like to liberate yourself from your life struggles or to find inner balance? The Inner Journey CD has 3 beautiful visualizations that will help you bring harmony to your life. As Joanna DeAngeli tells us to, live in a way that you leave enlightening footprints in your pathway as if they were stars pointing out the pathway to happiness. To find this CD, go to the bookstore on the Spiritist Society of Baltimore webpage, www.ssbaltimore.org. That is www.ssbaltimore.org, and start your inner journey today.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
The International Spiritist Council is organizing and promoting the 7th World Spiritist Congress, which will be held in Havana, Cuba on March 23rd through the 25th of 2013. The Congress theme will be Charity and Spiritual Education in Building a World of Peace. 150 years of the Gospel according to Spiritism. For more information, please visit www.7cem.org.
And now we return to our program.
Dear listener, we know you're feeling the joy of this moment. It's so much, it's so beautiful. Science and Spiritism all together, joining forces, trying to understand the human mind. Because the human mind, I would say this in a kind way, play tricks that we don't quite understand. And mediumship is still yet to be understood. And we are fascinated with the fact that Dr. Andrew Newberg, in collaboration with Dr. Judo Paris and other scientists in Brazil, such as Dr. Alexandra Moreira, have been doing this beautiful collaboration, trying to investigate more what happens to our brains while we are in trance states, such as psychography, writing, mediumship. There's so much to know. And Dr. Newberg, as we are talking about this, we briefly discussed before about the impact of practicing mediumship on mental health, but we don't yet have the answer to. We know that the mediums you investigated in this latest study, they were mentally healthy. Right. And we know that Dr. Alexandra Moreira has a previous paper showing that actually mediums, when they practice, especially under the framework of Spiritism, they can be quite mentally healthy, or sometimes even healthier than the ordinary person. But we don't have an answer for that yet, scientifically speaking, right? whether the practice would induce some form of
That's right.
mental stability.
We, at least we don't know for sure. I think the initial data certainly shows that, as you were kind of alluding to, that it certainly doesn't seem to result in any obvious negative aspects. How much it helps and whether it helps more than listening to music and going to church. We don't know how all of these different things relate to each other, and that's part of the larger picture of trying to understand this overall relationship between spirituality and health, and something that this is certainly an important piece to.
And the other question is about, we also mentioned briefly about the control, how we can control in this paradigm of the current paradigm of research, when we investigate mediumship. Can you tell it's harder to control the variables as expected as other types of scenarios?
I don't know if it's really harder to control those different variables, but each practice, each thing has its own unique elements to it that certainly need to be taken into consideration. And so every practice has its own challenges. Obviously, psychography, the person's writing, so you have to take that into consideration. And how do people write, and how do they use, what are they going to be writing with? What language are they going to be using? How are we going to interpret it? How do we make sure that they have enough things to write on? So that's different, obviously, than somebody who's engaged in a prayer practice where they're simply just repeating a prayer internally. But everything, when we did the speaking in tongues study, where they typically kind of dance around and move their body, that's different than a person who is doing a sitting meditation where it's very calm and very peaceful and they just kind of sit there. That to me is also part of the fun aspect of this research, which is the methodological challenges and how. In fact, I think this is always a piece that people sometimes miss, that this research actually challenges science, because we're now asking science to look at something which is not so easy to look at. And how do we do that? And how do we? We certainly have not perfected this by any stretch, but we're making little baby steps to trying to better understand that and try to figure out better how to adapt our scientific approaches to these very powerful and very important experiences that many human beings have.
That's so interesting. And then the ultimate question is about the paradigm. Many has been told about the need of a new paradigm to investigate phenomena such as mediumship. How much of this research is limited by the current paradigm, and how much of it we actually need to shift to achieve greater understanding? What do you think?
Well, I think if by talking about the current paradigm, we're talking about the current scientific paradigm, there's certainly a lot of people who are very skeptical about things that don't appear to be obviously related to the material world, or when they don't appear to be obviously related to the material world, try to find a way to fit them into the material world. And fundamentally, there's value in that approach. But I think, as you mentioned, to me, what is ultimately very exciting about this research is that we hopefully will see a greater shift towards understanding all of the kind of less tangible, if we should say it that way, aspects of our universe, our consciousness, whatever spiritual realm might be out there, God, whatever is out there. I think science should always take it upon itself to challenge itself and to explore every aspect of the universe, and not just kind of come to very basic material conclusions, or at least to be careful about making those conclusions until we're really sure about them. And I think that the subjective experiences that we have, our consciousness, the spiritual elements of ourselves, these are all very powerful parts of our universe that need to be brought into the larger scientific discussion, as well as science being brought into their discussion. So to me, it's a two-way street. There's a lot for all of us to learn, and I think we just have to really try to remain open to all different sides, and that's really what I try to express in most of my books. And even this field, sometimes people call it neurotheology, and I've written a book called Principles of Neurotheology, where we talk about this intersection, the intersection between science and religion, and how both can benefit and both can help each other benefit
Exactly.
from a better understanding. So
it's fascinating. It feels to me that you're opposite to what would be expected, the possible frustrations, because science can be somewhat frustrating because it's not like instant gratification. You think of a question and boom, you have a result. But it seems to us that you and the collaborators in this research and other research you have been producing, that you're not only enjoying, but there's so much in regards to the future perspective in that line of thought, right?
Absolutely. Well, I always think any good scientific study usually produces many more questions than answers, so we have a long way to go.
That's great. So, Dr. Newberg, we can't thank you enough for spending this special weekend, the Thanksgiving weekend, here with us at Kardec Radio. And if you have a final comment for the listener, the word is yours.
Well, I hope everyone continues to be fascinated by these kinds of questions, is open to all of the different perspectives that science as well as the spiritual can provide for us, and keep challenging themselves to learn more about themselves and more about the world around us. I think that's what it ultimately all comes down to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newberg. Kardec Radio audience is rejoicing at this moment as they are sending us tons of emails and comments. Very intrigued about.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And dear listener, here you have it. If you want to know more about these studies, you can go to the very website of Thomas Jefferson University. They have a great summary on the very study. It's at newswise.com. You just tap in Brazilian mediums and you're going to get through the very summary of the study. And if you want to read throughout the very paper, it was published at PLOS1.org. And you can also do the same. Just type in Dr. Andrew Newberg's name and you're going to access the very paper that was recently published. At Dr. Newberg's website, you can get a hold of lots of achievements, andrewnewberg.com. His book, especially the latest one, as he mentioned, Words Can Change Your Brain, the principles of neuroethology, how God changes your brain, and much, much more. He also has a special tab with summary on the most amazing research he has been doing in regards to religious experiences and the activity of the brain. There's so much to learn. And as he said, we need to keep an open mind because there's a lot more to know because questions are just popping in our minds. And for now, dear listener, we're going to give a short break. When we come back, we have more, much more. We have Dr. Magalhães summarizing Kardec's take on mediumship, followed by Kirsten DeMello's summary on ethical education, and then much, much more. Just stay here because Kardec Radio is here to nourish your soul.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Do you find yourself with no time to stop and read or meditate about spiritism or spirituality? We have a great solution for you. The audio CD called Unfolding Our Spiritual Nature, Path of Harmony by Ra Teixeira is an enlightening CD with a question and answer session as well. Feel the enrichment and purchase your copy today at www.ssbaltimore.org.
Spread the word. Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
Learn more about indigo and crystal children with the book The New Generation, The Spiritist View on Indigo and Crystal Children by Divaldo Franco with Vanessa Anzalone. Whether you're a parent or not, this book will enrich your mind. Go to www.ssbaltimore.org and click on Bookstore and purchase your copy today.
The Spiritist Magazine is a trimestral, digital periodical that publishes the latest news on the Spiritist thought and the movement in the USA and worldwide. Subscribe now at www.spiritistmagazine.com.
Now we return to our program.
Dear Kardec Radio listener, welcome to our segment Spiritism in Your Life.
Today's topic is mediumship. We can define mediumship for short as the interaction or influence by the spirits in any level. So we can think about this as we are small radio receivers. Through our thoughts, we can actually tune in the station we want. This station could be that of your mentor, your guardian angel, or suffering spirits. That really depends on what is the wavelength and what is the signal that you're projecting through your thought. And this connection is actually what people call mediumship. So the next question is, who are the mediums? Are they special in any way? And in the Medium's book, Allan Kardec brings to us the definition that everyone who's any degree influenced by spirit is, by that very fact, a medium. This faculty is inherent in man and is therefore no exclusive privilege. In other words, mediums are just like you and me. They carry the same responsibilities and weaknesses. They are also fallible. And they're not special beings. They're not fortune tellers. They're not oracles or sorcerers. This is just an organic capability that's inherent to all of us. And Allan Kardec also brings to us that this phenomena, occurring in virtue of natural law, are neither marvelous nor supernatural in the ordinary sense of the words. To summarize that idea, mediumship is not a miracle. It is a very complex phenomenon that takes place every day in our lives. And considering that, how can we identify the signs of mediumship in our daily lives? Number 1, intuition and inspiration. How many times we have that idea that seems to be coming from nowhere and suddenly strikes our mind? How many times we feel inspired to do something? Of course, inspiration and intuition can be also for good or bad things, and that really depends on where are we connecting our thoughts. Number 2, we have impression or feeling that something is happening or is around us. This is mostly designed to people that can recognize the presence of spirits, but in a vague impression, a sort of shuddering sensation that runs through the body, but we cannot really identify that precisely. Number 3, during our dreams we have the ability of communicate to spirits a little bit more freely because we are partially freed from our body and we can remember this many times, and this is one of the good examples of mediumistic phenomena. Number 4, now we have presentiment and premonition. Again, how many times we have the presentiment that something is about to happen, or we have a premonition in detail that something's going to happen. Number 5, fascination. And that's also one of the signs of an obsession, is that when you think that your ideas and your thoughts and what you're doing are so perfect, you start to be so connected to your ideas that you start losing the ability to criticize your own acts, and you get fascinated. Number 6, fixed ideas. How many times these fixed ideas come through our mind, either good or bad ones, that we cannot control, and they start to take over our ability to concentrate and focus. Number 7, physical disturbances that happen around us and we cannot explain. And also, finally, any sensorial observations that cannot be explained, including seeing, hearing, or feeling the presence of spirits. Some people do it more extensively, and some people don't. These are some of the basic signs of mediumship in your daily life. Dear listeners, we're coming to the end of our show, and we want to ask you the following question. How does mediumship, under the view and the teachings of Spiritism, can help us? Mediumistic phenomena, since early ages in our history, has opened eyes and opened doors for people to actually understand that there's something else out there, and call the attention of many people that started studying and started to put together many of theories and ideas that we're studying today in Spiritism. So if used properly, mediumship is an amazing tool and can be used for moral and intellectual development, and also for helping others through healing or through alleviating the suffering of other people. And Spiritism, most importantly, is going to bring us the principles to understand and make the good use of mediumship. Dear listeners, thank you again for being here with us today. And remember that mediumship is an exercise of discipline. God bless us.
Dear listener, as you just heard Dr. Magalhães mentioning to us, if you want to study more, because people have been writing us asking about where we can learn and more about mediumship according to Spiritism. Well, the Medium's book by Allan Kardec is the best option at this very moment for you. So you can buy it at Amazon.com or at ADCofAmerica.com. The Medium's book by Allan Kardec. It's considered a manual, and it describes of different sorts of mediumship and the ins and outs of mediumship, including questions such as the ones we were asking Dr. Andrew Newberg in this very program. And of course, if you want to listen to this very program again, it's going to be on demand at KardecRadio.com or blogtalkradio.com/Kardec Radio. By the way, our show is being featured front page at blogtalkradio.com, and it's going to be there for you, accessible throughout the day. Right now, if you want to know more about Dr. Newberg, again, his website is andrewnewberg.com. His latest book, Words That Can Change Your Brain. We are going to stream now the very segment, Spiritist Moment by Kirsten DeMello, when she's going to talk about a passage from the Spirit's book by Allan Kardec.
Hello, dear Kardec Radio listeners, and welcome back once again to the Spiritist Moment as we reflect with the Spiritist ideas and thoughts. Dear friends, we are giving and coming to the conclusion of the law of labor, and it's fascinating how the spirits choose to end this particular chapter that's located in part 3 of the Spirit's book, because they bring to us something that really requires and calls to us to really reflect deeply, because they ended talking about moral education. But before we get there, let us remember two things. The way that they end and conclude in the law of labor has everything to do with our modern society today, as we continue to experience our economic crisis to some degree or another, although we are in a new cycle, or hopefully cycling out of this old one. The spirits bring to us idea that is still happening today, especially within the society here in the U.S. And question 685, and they say, do humans have the right to retire in old age? And the spirits answer, yes. None are required to labor beyond their abilities to do so. And that's interesting because we've already learned in question 683, what is the limit of labor? And the spirits answer, the limit of one's strength. However, in this regard, God leaves people free will to decide what their limit is. So each one of us internally has our own limits. Your limit may be greater than my limit of labor. Perhaps others can work more and my ability is less. But God is so gracious as He allows us to choose what that limit is for us. So we know that we have a right, as we've learned that there is such thing as rest, and rest is needed after labor. The spirits have already talked to us about that in question 682, that rest serves to restore the strength of the body. But they go on with question 685a, and Kardec asks, but what resources do aging people have available if they must earn a living but cannot? Spirits answer, the strong should work for the weak. In the absence of a family, society should replace it. That is the law of charity. And dear friends, as we respectfully reflect with this, it's so pertinent to our everyday life and the way that our society, our government is running. We don't attempt even to try to be political here, dear friends, because we're neutral in that sense. We seek to reflect how the spirits are really bringing us these guidelines, and that this was applicable more than a century ago as much as it is applicable here today. And what's even more fascinating, the observation of question 685, when they tell us that one of the elements that has not been sufficiently studied, and they use the word pondered about, they talk about something called moral education. But before we reflect about that, they bring to us something very fascinating. And remember, dear friends, when was the Spirit's book written? 1857.
This was published in 1857, and the words here is as true today as they were more than a century ago. And we quote, as the spirits bring to us and explain to us with Allan Kardec, that economic science seeks a remedy in the balance between production and consumption. But this balance, supposing that it is possible, will always experience cycles. And during such phases, workers must still make a living. So it's interesting because they're telling us here, and probably many economists can already tell us this, that as a society, these types of economic cycles, they fluctuate, and that it's normal. But what the spirits are educating us about is that we must create a system of balance. When a certain group of aging adults or a certain group of people are unable to work, the strong should go and work for the weak. And what's interesting, we ask the question, why the spirits? And we're going to quote, in their observation of 685, they say that this element that has not been sufficiently pondered, it's the moral education. And first they say education, not the intellectual one, but the moral education. And they define moral education as something that creates habits, because education is the sum of acquired habits. And we could even go on to say that those who have already become morally educated are fulfilling this task of working for the weak if they are stronger at times. We can see this throughout our society. There are groups within our society who work for the weak. And to some degree, our government has set up a system where they have tried to address this issue when aging adults are no longer to be able to work for themselves. And one of the last things we leave you with, dear friends, to really reflect about, and the spirits tell us that disorder and lack of forethought are two sores that only a sound education can heal, moral education. That is the starting point, the real element of well-being, the guarantee of security for all. This is fascinating because we think about our economic crisis and we think about wanting to have more security in our lives. Well, the spirits tell us here's the guidelines for us. The starting point, they tell us, the real element of well-being, especially when we're suffering, and the guarantee for security of all. So it really is mind-blowing for us to reflect about that the spirits really are helping us, although we have free will to choose, but they're helping us to guide us in the right direction. Working on our own moral education is part of a healing process and is the real element of well-being and is our starting point and a guarantee for security for all of us. So, dear friends, let us contemplate this and reflect. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Kardec Radio, live, every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
A new great book and tool for kids and educators. The children's book, Our Father by the Spirit May, psychographed by Chico Xavier, is available for purchase at www.edisayofamerica.com. Buy your copy today.
Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
The newest edition of the Medium's Book by Allan Kardec is now available. Purchase your copy online or via your ebook reader. Simply go to www.edicofamerica.com today.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Spiritism for Everyone, the online study of the Spirit's Book and the Gospel according to Spiritism. Spiritism for Everyone meets every Wednesday evening and Saturday morning using the latest technology in web conferencing. You can join in from any computer in the comfort of your home or office, no matter where you are in the U.S. or the world. Spiritism for Everyone is open, free, and requires no registration. To access the web live meetings, go to www.spiritus.us. Spiritism for Everyone is a program of the United States Spiritist Council.
And now
Welcome to our Yes, Youth Education and Spiritism with Kardec Radio. I am Bernadette Leal, and I'll be spending a few minutes with you, inspiring to bring spiritual awareness and spiritist teachings to our youth, parents, and educators. We will continue talking about discipline. Last week, we answered the following question: how is discipline important to our spiritual and moral growth? And today's question is, how can discipline of what we think help us in our life? René Descartes was a great philosopher who once said, cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. Looking closely to this statement, we will see how the word I think is connected to I am, calling our attention to the idea that our thoughts reflect who we are. So, if we take into consideration that we are what we think, wouldn't it be wise to be concerned and more aware of our thoughts? Ask yourself, are my thoughts mostly of joy or sadness? Are they mostly negative or uplifting? We invite you to stop, observe, and think about what you think. It is common to hear people complaining about their lives, how unhappy they are, or how things are not the way they want. They do not realize that the more they complain, the more they become stuck on that matter. When our minds are surrounded by negative thoughts, we vibrate and project that energy to the universe, attracting what we think. Dear listeners, by dwelling on our negative thoughts, we are feeding them. It is like adding more fuel to the fire. We give power to those thoughts, making them grow. Consequently, we diminish our willpower, affecting our health and emotional state. The discipline of thought is essential to help us to have a better state of mind and life. One of the first steps to achieve that is by recognizing the trigger thought, which is the negative thought that creates a chain reaction. Next, do our best to stop it as soon as it pops up in our head, so we will not begin to poison our mind. By doing that, we are in control, not allowing the negative thoughts to control us. Here's an example that many of us may relate. Let's say your neighbor who always says hello to you in the mornings did not greet you today. Quickly, your mind starts thinking about the situation, the trigger thought, and you begin to question yourself if you did anything wrong. Was it because I played music too loud last weekend? Was it because my dog barked all morning? Or your ego is hurt, and you say, how rude! I will no longer talk to her. And soon you'll be calling your husband to complain about the neighbor, mentioning that you do not deserve such treatment. Oh, next, you post a comment on a social media about what happened, feeling that negative energy. What a waste of time. When we let those thoughts multiply, we take away precious time that could be directed to doing something more useful to help ourselves and others. Developing the discipline of mind is not denying that we think negatively once in a while, but recognizing the trigger thought when it arises and changing its vibration. This can be done by saying something positive, an affirmation, visualization, meditating, praying, going to a spiritual center, receiving a posse, reading inspiring and spiritual books, and even singing a joyful song. But in order to be successful, we must make the effort to stop that thought from start. The more we practice it, the more discipline we will have. This is a great tool to teach our children. For the little ones, we can help them to change their negative thoughts by making them laugh, doing something fun, saying good things about them so they can feel better about themselves. With teenagers, we can talk to them and explain how negative thoughts affect them emotionally, physically, and also spiritually, and teach them the tools to change their vibrations to something positive when they feel down, frustrated, or depressed. They will greatly benefit from those tools and will be using them in their lives as they grow up. The Spiritist philosophy reminds us that thinking is a property of the spirit. If it were a characteristic only of the brain, how is it possible that spirits can communicate with us through thoughts if they no longer have their physical body? Spiritism brings us awareness that our thoughts will connect with the spirits that are in the same vibration level. On chapter 14 of the book The Genesis by Allan Kardec, item 16, Kardec also explains about the importance of our thoughts and how its energy can be manipulated. He says, the action of spirits upon spiritual fluids has consequences of a direct and capital importance for incarnated beings. From the instant that these fluids are the vehicle of thought, that thoughts can modify properties of them. It is evident that they must be impregnated by the good or bad qualities of the thoughts which put them in vibration, modified by the purity or impurity of the sentiments. Bad thoughts corrupt the spiritual fluids, as deleterious miasma corrupts the air we breathe. Kardec Radio listeners, the discipline of the mind is essential for a better life. If we want peace, have peaceful thoughts. If we want love, have thoughts of love. If we want healing, have healthy thoughts. We can change our lives by changing what and how we think. And as James Allen once said, you are today where your thoughts have brought you. You will be tomorrow where your thoughts take you. Thanks for listening to Yes. And if you have any question that would like us to answer, please email them to Kardec at kardecradio.com.
Good morning, dear Kardec Radio listeners, and welcome to one more program with God at Home. I am Noel Fonseca.
And I am Gabi Ferreira. Today's lesson is from the book Jesus in the Home by the Spirit Neo Lúcio and psychographed by Chico Xavier. It's entitled The Need for Understanding.
One of the disciples had come to the home gospel worship with a downcast face. In response to the Lord's fraternal questioning, he explained that he had been treated disrespectfully on the street. He had asked a number of debtors for payment, but they had responded with ingratitude and sarcasm. Christ did not offer the man any personal advice, but obviously exhorting all the attendees, he narrated the following story.
A great expositor of the text of Job possessed a unique willingness for endeavors of understanding and kindness, and perhaps because of this, he established a school in which he pontificated with unquestionable wisdom. On one particular occasion, he was helping a troubled student who often complained about how he was mistreated in the town square. Patiently, he went with the student through the streets of Jerusalem, begging for alms for various temple services.
The majority of the passers-by either gave or refused to give alms with a sense of indifference. But On one particularly busy corner, a seemingly healthy man answered their plea with harshness and ridicule. The master took the student by the hand, and both of them cautiously continued on their way. They hadn't gone very far when they looked back and saw the man fall to the ground, writhing in violent pain. Everyone rushed to his aid. They soon realized that the irascible brother was suffering from deadly colic.
They continued on their way when they came across a gentleman who didn't even stoop to respond to their request. He merely gave them a hard and rancorous stare. Teacher and ward followed him, and when the strange character reached his home, they saw that a small group of weeping people were waiting for him, and that he joined them in copious tears. The two of them learned that the unfortunate man had come home to a dead daughter.
They continued begging on the street and were soon cussed by a young man who they had asked for alms. Expectantly, they withdrew a ways, and after half an hour of observing him, they realized that the wretched man was merely insane.
Then they heard outrageous words from an old man who was promising them prison and stoning. But after some time, they found out that the poor man was simply a bankrupt businessman who had gone from master to slave because of his enormous debt.
As the day was coming to a close, the respectable teacher invited the disciple to head back to the school with him and asked, "Did you learn the lesson? Accept the need for understanding as a holy commandment in life. Never again will you complain about those who display expressions of rebelliousness or despair in the streets." The first one who we came to was an ordinary ill man. The second one had had a death in his house. The third was insane, and the fourth one had gone bankrupt. In most cases, those who treat us with disdain are following a path that is even darker and thornier than our own.
And completing the lesson, the Lord concluded before the amazed disciples,
"Whenever we meet up with bearers of affliction, we must show mercy and help them to regain their inner peace. The bull still has horns because it has not yet received the gift of wings. We commonly complain about the sheep that is bothering our repose by bleating in terror, but we rarely remember that the poor animal is under a heavy noose on its way to the slaughterhouse."
Dear listener, we hope you have enjoyed the show. Today, we were talking about the neuroscientific evaluation of mediums' brains. And next week, we're going to be here with the most expected interview with the renowned Haroldo Dutra Dias from Brazil. He's going to share with us insights about several different topics, including mediumship. And you'll be here joining us, sharing, and we'll be also streaming songs by James Marotta, and we hope you enjoy the show as well. For the time being, you can send us your questions and your suggestions to Kardec Radio email at kardecradio.com or kardecradio@gmail.com, or directly at the contact form at our website, kardecradio.com. For the time being, we are going to invite you to a beautiful prayer, a prayer to nourish our souls. It's the prayer for all of us who are around the world experiencing extreme difficulties. And specifically, dear listener, we'd like you to join us to pray especially for all the children who are suffering in those war zones such as Gaza. Let us pray for them, because we have no idea whatsoever what it is to go through war times, being a child or an elderly or a woman, and suffering the hardships of wars. So let us raise our thoughts right now and feel the love that comes from above. Dear Lord of life, during this Thanksgiving weekend, we have much to be thankful for. But most especially, we would like to pray asking for protection for our children around the world, especially those who are suffering the hardships, the challenges of being in a war zone, such as in Gaza. May the angelic hands of your messengers bring them comfort, and to the elderly as well. May we raise our awareness on the need to expand our hearts to more ethical, moral levels, so we may become more fraternal, kinder, exercising greater levels of compassion, giving our hands to one another and creating a new world where love, charity, and justice are just second nature. And so be it. Dear listener, we also send our best vibrations to our dear Dr. Andrew Newberg and his collaborators in Brazil, especially Dr. Julio Perez, Dr. Alexander Moreira, for the amazing work they have been doing. For the time being, we wish you many blessings, hoping that you'll be here at Kardec Radio next week, because Dr. Haroldo Dutra Dias is going to be here with us, rejoicing our hearts with his great mind and loving heart. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Kardec Radio, broadcasting live every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Email us and share your comments at www.kardecradio.com. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.